Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now, let's step inside. The ride to death row. The ride begins long before the prison gates come into view. It starts in silence. Inside a transport vehicle where the windows are sealed, the restraints are tight, and time stops behaving normally. For the person in the back, the sentence has already been spoken. There are no arguments left. No courtroom. No audience. Only the road. Every mile traveled brings one certainty closer. This is not a temporary place, and this is not a misunderstanding. This is death row. During transport, there is no conversation about what comes next. No explanations. No reassurance. The system does not need cooperation anymore. It only needs compliance. As the vehicle moves deeper into Texas, the outside world fades. Gas stations, highways, small towns, all passing by for the last time without ceremony. The ride is designed this way on purpose, because by the time the gates finally appear, the mind has already begun to adjust, not to freedom, but to permanence. This is not the moment of execution. That comes later, sometimes years later. This is the moment when identity starts to dissolve, when routine is replaced by waiting, and when the reality of a death sentence becomes physical. This documentary follows the first 72 hours after arrival on Texas death row, beginning with a ride that no one comes back from. When the sentence becomes final, the moment a death sentence becomes final does not arrive with drama. There is no sudden movement, no raised voices, no cinematic pause. In most cases, it arrives quietly, through paperwork, court notices, and legal language that strips the outcome of emotion. Appeals are exhausted. Deadlines expire. Motions are denied. Somewhere in a courthouse or administrative office, a final decision is recorded, stamped, and filed. For the system, it is procedural. For the inmate, it is irreversible. Until this moment, death row exists as a possibility, a threat deferred by time, by lawyers, by the hope that something might still change. Years can pass under that uncertainty. Some inmates convince themselves that the sentence is theoretical, that execution is something that happens to others, not to them. But when the sentence becomes final, that distance collapses. The future narrows. From that point forward, the state is no longer deciding if the sentence will be carried out, only when. Inside prison walls, this shift is not announced publicly. There is no formal ceremony marking the transition from condemned to finalized. Instead, the inmate is notified through official channels. A brief meeting, a document delivered, a statement read without commentary. There is no discussion. Questions are not encouraged. Explanations are not offered. The system assumes that by this stage, everything that needed to be said has already been said. What follows is a period that many former inmates and correctional staff describe as the most psychologically destabilizing phase of death row, not because of violence or punishment, but because of clarity. Hope, even unrealistic hope, serves a purpose. It creates distance from fear. Finality removes that distance. Once the sentence is confirmed, institutional processes begin moving quietly in the background. Files are transferred. Classification statuses are updated. Security arrangements are reviewed. Transport protocols are prepared, often without the inmate knowing the exact timing. Nothing happens all at once, and that is intentional. The uncertainty surrounding when the transfer will occur becomes part of the pressure. Days pass, then weeks. Every unexpected movement, a guard stopping at the cell longer than usual, a name called over the intercom, an unplanned escort, becomes a possible signal. This state of anticipation is not accidental. It is a feature of the system. Psychologists who have studied long-term confinement describe this phase as one where time loses consistency. Without a future that can be imagined, the mind begins to focus obsessively on routine details. Footsteps in the hallway, shift changes, the sound of keys, the opening and closing of doors. Small cues take on exaggerated meaning. Sleep becomes irregular. Appetite changes. Memory becomes selective. Some inmates withdraw entirely, reducing communication to the minimum required. Others become hyper-aware, attempting to control what little remains under their influence, posture, speech, behavior, as a way to reclaim dignity. Correctional officers are trained not to engage emotionally during this phase. Their role is not to explain the system, only to enforce it. Professional distance is emphasized. Conversations stay procedural. Any deviation risks appearing as favoritism, or worse, as false reassurance. This emotional neutrality can feel colder than open hostility, because it confirms what the paperwork already implies. The system has moved on. At this point, life inside the prison changes subtly. Privileges may be adjusted. Movement patterns can shift. Monitoring becomes more deliberate. Even if the inmate has already been housed in high-security conditions, death row introduces a different kind of confinement, one centered on permanence rather than punishment. On death row, there is no progression toward release, no behavior-based improvement path, no end date to work toward. Every rule exists to preserve order, not rehabilitation. For many inmates, the realization does not arrive all at once. It comes in fragments, a phrase overheard, a routine altered, a form requiring a new signature. Each piece confirms what the sentence already means, but the mind struggles to accept. Denial can persist even after finalization. This is not delusion. It is survival. Human psychology resists outcomes that cannot be changed. Faced with absolute certainty, the brain often delays acceptance as long as possible. This delay can last weeks, months, even years. But the system does not wait for acceptance. Once the sentence is final, preparations for transport begin. The inmate is rarely told the exact day in advance. This is done for security reasons, preventing self-harm, escape attempts, or disruptions, but it also ensures compliance. A process that is unpredictable is harder to resist. The first sign that transfer is approaching is often indirect. Property inventory checks, medical reviews, updated identification photographs. These steps appear routine, but taken together, they signal that the inmate is being prepared for movement, not temporary movement, permanent relocation. Texas death row is not simply another housing unit. It is a destination designed for long-term isolation under maximum security. Transfer there marks the end of uncertainty and the beginning of a new kind of waiting, one measured not in release dates, but in legal calendars and execution warrants. By the time transport is officially scheduled, the outcome is already set. The ride itself is not about punishment or intimidation. It is about transition, moving a person from one psychological state into another, from possibility to finality. And when the transport vehicle finally arrives, there is no announcement explaining what comes next. There is only a directive. The sentence is final. The ride is next. Transport to Texas death row. The transport does not begin with a warning. There is no countdown, no final announcement, no official acknowledgement that this is a one-way move. For security reasons, inmates are rarely told the exact day or time they will be transferred. Advance notice creates variables, emotional instability, resistance, or self-harm, and the system is designed to minimize all of them. Instead, the first sign often comes early in the morning. A cell door opens at an unexpected hour. A name is called. Instructions are given in short, neutral sentences. There is no explanation of destination, no discussion of timing. By the time the inmate understands what is happening, the process is already underway. Personal property is limited to what can be documented, searched, and approved. Items accumulated over years, letters, books, photographs, are inventoried and boxed separately. Some will follow later. Others may never arrive at all. Restraints are applied methodically. Handcuffs, waist chain, leg irons. Each piece serves a practical purpose, but together they also send a clear message. Control has fully transferred to the state. Movement is no longer negotiated. It is enforced. Transport to Texas death row is handled under maximum security protocols. Routes are not disclosed in advance. Vehicles are unmarked or minimally identified. In some cases, transport involves multiple transfers, moving between facilities, holding points, or staging areas. To reduce predictability, the inmate is not told how long the journey will take. Time becomes difficult to track almost immediately. Windows are sealed or heavily tinted. Communication with transport officers is limited to basic instructions. Conversation is discouraged. Silence is preferred. For hours, sometimes longer, the only sensation is motion, road noise, engine vibration, the pressure of restraints. Without visual reference points, the mind begins to drift. Thoughts loop. Memories surface unexpectedly. Small physical discomforts become exaggerated. The inability to shift position or stretch freely turns minutes into something heavier. This is not accidental. Transport procedures are designed to discourage resistance and maintain order, but they also function as a psychological transition. The inmate is being moved from a place of uncertainty into a place of permanence. The journey itself becomes part of that adjustment. There is no dramatic moment where someone says, "You are going to death row." That understanding develops gradually, mile by mile. Stops when they occur are controlled and brief. The inmate remains restrained at all times. Interaction with other prisoners is avoided whenever possible. Meals, if provided, are basic and utilitarian. There is no attempt to offer comfort. This is not punishment. It is policy. Correctional officers assigned to transport are trained to remain professional and emotionally distant. They are not there to explain the system or respond to questions about the future. Their responsibility is security, not interpretation. Even well-intentioned conversation is avoided because any suggestion of empathy can be misread, and any misreading can create instability. As the journey continues, external landmarks lose meaning. Towns pass without names. Roads blur together. For the inmate, the world outside the vehicle becomes abstract, something observed indirectly without participation. For many, this is the moment when denial begins to weaken. The sentence, once confined to paper in courtrooms, now has physical momentum. Every mile confirms that the process is real, irreversible, and already in motion. By the time the vehicle turns off the main road and onto secure property, the transition is nearly complete. The presence of fencing becomes noticeable first, then gates, cameras, guard towers. The architecture changes, functional, reinforced, deliberate. There is no ambiguity about purpose. Arrival procedures begin before the vehicle stops. Identification is confirmed. Clearances are checked. Timing is logged. The inmate remains restrained until custody is formally transferred. Doors open in sequence. Commands are given calmly, without urgency. There is no hostility. There does not need to be. The facility is designed to enforce compliance through structure alone. At this point, the inmate has not yet entered a cell. Intake has not begun. Classification has not been assigned. But something fundamental has already changed. The transport phase has ended. The inmate is no longer moving toward an outcome. They have arrived at it. In the next chapter, the process continues, not through motion, but through procedure. As intake begins and death row becomes more than a destination, it becomes a daily reality. Intake under condemnation. Arrival does not mean rest. When the transport ends, the process does not slow down, it tightens. Before an inmate ever sees a cell, intake begins. This phase is not designed for comfort, explanation, or adjustment. It exists to convert a person into a classification, a set of restrictions, permissions, and controls that will define every day that follows. Under condemnation, intake follows a stricter protocol. The inmate is escorted from the transport vehicle through a controlled entry zone, often separate from general population processing areas. Movement is linear and supervised. Every door opens only after the previous one closes. At no point is there uncertainty about who is in control. Restraints remain in place. Identification is verified multiple times. Name, number, sentence status. This repetition is intentional. Errors at this stage are unacceptable, and the system is built to eliminate ambiguity. Once verification is complete, the physical intake begins. Clothing issued during transport is removed. Personal items are confiscated, logged, and sealed. Each item is documented, not for sentimental reasons, but for accountability. Nothing enters death row without approval. The inmate is searched thoroughly. This is not about suspicion. It is about policy. Strip searches at intake are mandatory and procedural. They are conducted without commentary, without judgment, and without deviation. Officers are trained to remain neutral. Neutrality reinforces authority more effectively than aggression. After the search, standardized prison clothing is issued. The uniform is plain, functional, and identical to those worn by others under the same sentence. Individuality is not a consideration at this stage. Uniformity is. Medical screening follows quickly. Vital signs are taken. Injuries are noted. Mental health evaluations are conducted, often with limited dialogue. These assessments are not therapy sessions. They exist to determine risk, particularly the risk of self-harm during the initial adjustment period. Condemned inmates are considered high risk during intake, not because of violence toward others, but because of what the sentence represents. Psychological staff look for indicators: disorientation, extreme withdrawal, agitation, dissociation. Notes are taken. Files are updated. Recommendations are made, but the structure of death row leaves little room for modification. The environment itself is the constant. During intake, time becomes fragmented. There is waiting, followed by sudden activity. Instructions are brief. Explanations are minimal. The inmate is moved from station to station, room to room, each one designed for function rather than comfort. There are no windows. Clocks are rarely visible. Without external reference points, the sense of duration dissolves. Minutes stretch. Hours compress. This disorientation is not accidental. It prevents fixation and reduces the likelihood of resistance. Throughout the process, the sentence is never discussed. No one says death row aloud. No one references execution. The system treats the sentence as a settled fact, not a topic for conversation. Acknowledging it verbally would introduce emotion, and emotion is inefficient. By the time intake concludes, the inmate has been documented, searched, evaluated, and stripped of all unsanctioned possessions. What remains is a person prepared for placement. Classification is next. On death row, classification does not determine progress. It determines containment. Housing assignments are based on security requirements, medical needs, and institutional logistics, not behavior or rehabilitation potential. There is no incentive structure. There is no advancement. The goal is stability. Once classification is finalized, movement resumes. The inmate is escorted deeper into the facility, away from intake areas and into restricted housing. The architecture becomes more controlled. Corridors narrow. Sound changes. Doors are heavier. Each step moves farther from anything resembling normal prison life. At no point is the inmate asked if they understand the process. Understanding is assumed. As the final door opens, there is no announcement explaining where they are being placed or how long they will remain there. The escort ends with a simple directive: step inside. The door closes. The sound is unmistakable. This is not temporary housing. This is not observation. This is death row, the first cell. The first cell is not introduced. There is no explanation of its purpose, no orientation, no statement about how long it will be occupied. The inmate is escorted forward, instructed to step inside, and then left alone with the sound of the door closing behind them. That sound matters. It is not loud, but it is final, a mechanical confirmation that movement has ended. For the first time since transport began, there are no commands being issued, no forms to sign, no procedures unfolding. The system withdraws, leaving the inmate alone with the environment it has chosen for them. The cell is small, but not improvised. Every element is fixed, intentional, and designed to endure. Walls are solid. Corners are minimal. Surfaces are chosen for durability rather than comfort. Nothing here is accidental. There is no personalization. The bed is built into the structure, often concrete or reinforced steel, with a thin mattress placed on top. It offers support, not rest. The toilet and sink are combined into a single stainless steel unit, positioned to be usable but never comfortable. A narrow shelf or desk may be attached to the wall, just large enough to serve its function. The space is not designed to harm. It is designed to limit. Lighting is constant but controlled. Whether natural light enters depends on the facility and the cell's placement, but even when a window exists, It is narrow and positioned to prevent meaningful views. The outside world is reduced to light, shadow, and vague movement. Time becomes difficult to track almost immediately. There is no clock, no calendar, no marker to separate 1 hour from the next. The inmate is left to estimate time by routine sounds, doors opening, footsteps passing, distant announcements. But those sounds are inconsistent and intentionally muted. This uncertainty is part of the design. In ordinary confinement, inmates orient themselves through routine. On death row, routine exists, but it does not provide comfort. It provides structure without direction. The first minutes inside the cell are often spent standing, not because there is nowhere to sit, but because sitting implies acceptance. Many inmates hesitate before touching the bed, the walls, or the fixtures. Physical contact makes the space real. Avoiding it delays that realization. Eventually, contact becomes unavoidable. The body settles where it can. The mind does not. Thoughts arrive without sequence. Some replay court proceedings. Others return to moments years earlier, searching for a point where something could have changed. Many experience an overwhelming awareness of absence, family, conversation, unpredictability, choice. This reaction is not dramatic. It is internal. The silence inside a death row cell is not complete, but it is heavy. Sound does not disappear. It becomes distant and indistinct. Conversations are not overheard. There is no ambient noise or community. Even when other inmates are nearby, architecture and policy work together to prevent meaningful interaction. Communication is restricted by design. This isolation serves multiple purposes. It reduces coordination between inmates. It limits emotional escalation, and it forces attention inward, where resistance is more difficult to sustain. The first cell becomes a psychological mirror. Without distraction, the mind turns inward. Small sensations become prominent. The texture of the mattress, the temperature of the air, the pressure of restraint still lingering in memory. Hunger and fatigue may exist, but they are secondary to awareness of permanence. This is not a holding cell. This is not temporary segregation. This is where life will occur from now on. For some inmates, denial resurfaces at this stage. The cell feels unreal, as if it exists outside normal experience. Others experience the opposite, a sudden, crushing clarity that arrives without warning. There is no universal response, but nearly all experience a shift in how they perceive themselves. Identity, once defined by roles or relationships, begins to narrow. The system recognizes the inmate only as a sentence and a number. The environment reinforces this reduction. There are no mirrors that encourage self-reflection, no objects that suggest individuality, only function. The first night often arrives without ceremony. Lights dim or change intensity, but they do not disappear entirely. Sleep is fragmented. The unfamiliar environment resists rest. The body is exhausted from transport and intake, but the mind remains alert, scanning for cues, sounds, or signals that never come. This state, physical fatigue paired with mental vigilance, is common. It is also unsustainable. As hours pass, thoughts slow, not because they resolve, but because they repeat. Memory loops, hypotheticals replay, conversations imagined but never spoken. The future appears abstract, difficult to picture beyond the next routine check or meal delivery. This narrowing of focus is not accidental. Psychological studies of long-term confinement show that when the future becomes undefined, the present expands. Small routines take on exaggerated importance. Meals, counts, and brief movements become the only markers of progression. In the first cell, this process begins immediately. Morning arrives without announcement. There is no sunrise to observe, no natural transition to signal a new day. The only indication is procedural. A meal slot opening, a count being conducted, footsteps returning. Day 1 ends. Day 2 begins. But inside the cell, they feel identical. At this stage, the inmate begins to understand that death row is not defined by anticipation of execution alone. It is defined by repetition, by days structured identically without milestones or endpoints. The realization is subtle but powerful. Life has not ended, but it has been reduced. The first night. Night on death row does not announce itself. There is no visible sunset, no evening, sounds drifting in from the outside. The transition from day to night happens quietly, marked only by a change in routine, a meal delivered, a final count conducted, the reduction of movement in the corridor. Inside the cell, the difference is subtle but unmistakable. The light does not go out completely. It dims, shifts, or remains constant depending on policy, but darkness is never absolute. The environment is designed to be observable at all times. Privacy is limited, even in isolation. For the inmate, this creates a strange contradiction. They are alone, but never unobserved. The first night is often the longest stretch of uninterrupted time since the sentence became final. There are no procedures scheduled, no movement expected, no forms to complete. The system pauses, and in that pause, awareness expands. Sleep does not come easily. The body may be exhausted, but the mind resists surrender. Every unfamiliar sound is magnified. Distant doors closing, faint footsteps, mechanical hums that have no clear source. Without context, the brain treats each noise as potential significance. This vigilance is instinctive. It is the mind's attempt to regain control in an environment where control no longer exists. Lying on the narrow bed, the inmate becomes acutely aware of their own presence. The pressure of the mattress, the temperature of the air, the rhythm of breathing. Sensations that would normally fade into the background now demand attention. Time stretches. Minutes feel longer than they should. Hours lose definition. Without a clock, the passage of time must be inferred through routine sounds or internal estimates, both unreliable. This uncertainty becomes its own form of stress. For many inmates, the first night is when emotional containment begins to fail. During transport and intake, the mind is occupied with procedure. There is no space to process what is happening. But alone in the cell, with no distractions, suppressed thoughts resurface. Some replay the trial in fragments. A phrase spoken, a look exchanged, a moment that now feels decisive. Others fixate on family, imagining conversations that cannot happen, or wondering how the news has been received on the outside. These thoughts are not comforting. They are intrusive. Attempts to redirect attention often fail. Without external stimulation, the mind cycles through the same material repeatedly. This looping is common during early isolation and can intensify anxiety, grief, and despair. Not all inmates react the same way. Some withdraw inward, reducing thought to the bare minimum required to function. Others experience bursts of emotion, anger, fear, disbelief, that arrive suddenly and then fade, leaving exhaustion behind. Crying may occur, so may silence. Both are private. The environment does not respond. At some point during the night, most inmates attempt to sleep. It rarely lasts long. Sleep comes in fragments, shallow, interrupted, easily broken by noise or internal tension. Dreams, if they occur, are often vivid and disorienting. Waking is abrupt. There is no gradual return to awareness. Consciousness snaps back into the same confined space, reinforcing the reality of where they are. For a brief moment, confusion may surface, followed immediately by recognition. The cell has not changed. Neither has the sentence. This cycle can repeat several times before morning. By the later hours of night, fatigue begins to dull emotional intensity. Thoughts slow. Resistance weakens. The mind shifts into a more passive state, conserving energy rather than seeking resolution. This is not acceptance. It is adaptation. Correctional staff are aware that the first night carries elevated risk. Monitoring remains consistent, but interaction is minimal. The goal is observation, not engagement. Intervening unnecessarily can escalate stress rather than reduce it. Silence is maintained. When morning finally approaches, it does not feel like relief. There is no sense of completion or progress. Instead, the inmate realizes something more unsettling. The night has passed and nothing has changed. The world has moved forward outside the facility, but inside the cell, continuity has been preserved. This realization marks a subtle psychological shift. The first night teaches an unspoken lesson. Time on death row does not heal. It repeats, with daylight routines returning. The system resumes its rhythm. Counts are conducted. Meals are delivered. Movement elsewhere in the facility increases, slightly. But inside the cell, the experience remains the same. The inmate has survived the first night. And survival, on death row, is not a victory. It is a beginning. Psychological shift. The psychological shift does not happen all at once. It does not arrive with a breakdown, a moment of collapse, or a single realization. Instead, it unfolds gradually, almost invisibly, as the mind begins adapting to an environment that does not respond to emotion, resistance, or time. By the second and third day on death row, the inmate has learned something crucial. Nothing they feel alters the system. Fear does not slow it. Anger does not challenge it. Hope does not influence it. This understanding marks the beginning of a mental transition, from reaction to adjustment. In the early hours, the mind remains active, searching for meaning, explanation, or escape. But when none appear, thought patterns begin to simplify. The brain, faced with prolonged uncertainty and lack of control, shifts into a conservation mode. This is not resignation. It is adaptation. Psychologists refer to this process as cognitive narrowing. When future outcomes cannot be influenced, the mind reduces focus to what can be managed in the present. On death row, that present is extremely limited. Meals, counts, sleep, silence. Everything else fades into abstraction. Time perception changes first. Without meaningful variation between days, the brain loses its ability to mark progression. Hours feel longer, yet days blur together. Events that occurred yesterday feel distant. Weeks pass without distinct memories to separate them. This distortion is one of the most consistent effects reported by inmates in long-term isolation. The mind stops thinking in terms of next week or next month. It begins thinking in terms of after count or before lights. The future shrinks. As this happens, emotional responses begin to dull, not because emotion disappears, but because sustained emotional intensity is exhausting. The nervous system cannot remain in a constant state of alert without consequence. So it adjusts. Fear becomes quieter. Anger becomes contained. Grief becomes background noise. This emotional flattening is often mistaken for acceptance. It is not. It is a protective response, a way to continue functioning when there is nothing left to influence. For some inmates, this shift is experienced as numbness. For others, it manifests as detachment, a sense of watching one's own life from a distance. Thoughts feel less personal. Memories lose emotional weight. Identity begins to loosen. Outside prison, identity is reinforced by interaction, family roles, social feedback, decision-making. On death row, those reinforcements disappear. There is no audience for personality, no reward for expression. Over time, the self becomes quieter. Inmates report speaking less, even when opportunities arise, not because they are forbidden to speak, but because conversation feels unnecessary. Silence becomes a default state, not the absence of sound, but the absence of internal urgency. This is where the most profound changes death row produces. The mind stops reaching outward. Routine replaces intention. Every day follows a predictable structure, and within that structure, the inmate learns what is expected and nothing more. Compliance becomes automatic, not because of fear of punishment, but because resistance offers no benefit. This does not mean the inmate agrees with the sentence. It means they have learned where effort is wasted. At this stage, some inmates develop strict personal routines, pacing the cell, organizing possessions repeatedly, counting steps or breaths. These behaviors serve a purpose. They create the illusion of control in an environment designed to remove it. Others abandon routine entirely, allowing days to pass with minimal activity. Both responses are adaptations, not failures. Mental health professionals recognize this phase as a critical turning point. If the inmate adapts too rigidly, psychological stagnation can occur. If adaptation fails entirely, emotional distress intensifies. The system does not intervene unless stability is threatened, because from an institutional perspective, emotional neutrality is preferable to volatility. The psychological shift also alters how the inmate views the sentence itself. Execution, once an abstract endpoint, becomes distant, not because it is denied, but because it cannot be acted upon. Thinking about it offers no immediate utility, so the mind postpones it. This postponement is not hope. It is compartmentalization. The sentence is placed somewhere beyond daily awareness, accessed only when required by legal updates or external reminders. This allows daily survival without constant confrontation. Over time, this compartment becomes sealed. Some inmates describe it as placing the sentence on a shelf, acknowledging its presence but refusing to engage with it unless forced to do so. This psychological boundary allows them to function in the present, even as the future remains unchanged. By the end of the first few days, the inmate has not accepted death row, but they have learned how to exist within it. This is a shift from reacting to enduring, from asking questions to observing patterns, from resisting the environment to being shaped by it. Life measured in appeals. On death row, time is no longer measured in days or years. It is measured in paperwork. Appeals become the only recognized movement forward, not toward freedom, but toward delay. Court filings, legal reviews, and procedural deadlines replace birthdays, holidays, and seasons. These events do not bring closure. They bring suspension. After the psychological shift settles in, the inmate begins to understand that death row is not defined by execution alone. It is defined by waiting within a legal system that moves slowly, deliberately, and without urgency for resolution. Appeals are not optional. They are automatic, complex, and deeply procedural. Their purpose is not to offer hope, but to ensure that the sentence has been examined from every legal angle. This process can take years, sometimes decades, and unfolds largely outside the inmate's control. For the condemned, participation is minimal. Documents arrive through official channels. Legal language replaces human conversation. Dates are referenced abstractly, months away, years away, without emotional framing. Outcomes are communicated clinically: approved, denied, remanded, deferred. Each word carries weight, but none brings certainty. Unlike ordinary prison life, where progress can be observed through classification changes or privilege adjustments, death row offers no visible advancement. Appeals move independently of behavior. Compliance does not accelerate them. Resistance does not slow them. This disconnect reinforces a core truth. Effort has limits here. For some inmates, appeals become a psychological anchor. They provide structure, something external to anticipate. For others, they become a source of chronic tension, reopening wounds that have begun to scar over. Both responses are common. When an appeal is pending, time feels suspended. Routine continues, but attention drifts toward the unknown outcome. When a decision arrives, it rarely resolves anything. Approval often leads to further review. Denial leads to the next procedural step. Resolution is always deferred. This cycle creates a unique form of psychological strain, one rooted not in fear of execution, but in uncertainty without endpoint. The inmate learns to live in a state where nothing is final, yet nothing improves. Even hope becomes regulated. Legal counsel may caution against emotional investment. Optimism must remain restrained. Celebrating small procedural victories can make future losses harder to endure. As a result, emotional response to legal updates becomes muted. A denial is acknowledged, not mourned. An approval is noted, not celebrated. This emotional flattening mirrors the earlier psychological shift, but operates on a deeper level. The inmate learns not only to survive daily confinement, but to survive expectation itself. Years pass this way. During this time, the outside world changes, laws evolve, technologies advance, social norms shift. Inside the cell, those changes arrive slowly, if at all. The inmate's understanding of time becomes disconnected from reality beyond the prison walls. This separation can be disorienting. Appeals require memory, revisiting trial details, recalling testimony, re-examining moments frozen in the past. This repeated backward focus prevents closure. The mind is pulled between an unchangeable past and an uncertain future, with little grounding in the present. For many, this produces a sense of unreality. Life begins to feel paused, as if it exists outside normal progression. Aging becomes noticeable only through physical sensation, stiffness, fatigue, diminished resilience, rather than through life events. Milestones disappear. There are no promotions, no graduations, no anniversaries worth marking, only filings. Correctional staff are largely absent from this process. Legal developments are not discussed within the institution beyond procedural necessity. The system enforces the sentence, not the legal debate surrounding it. This separation reinforces the inmate's isolation. The court exists elsewhere. The consequences exist here. Over time, some inmates disengage from the appeals process emotionally, allowing attorneys to manage it entirely. Others remain intensely involved, tracking every detail, every motion, every potential outcome. Neither approach offers peace. Disengagement can feel like surrender. Engagement can feel like endless reopening of wounds. By this stage, the inmate understands that death row is not a countdown in the traditional sense. It is not a straight line toward an end. It is a loop, a cycle of review without resolution, movement without progress. This realization reshapes how the future is imagined. Instead of asking when something will happen, the inmate begins to ask if anything will ever change. The answer is never clear. And so life continues. Meals arrive. Counts are conducted. Lights change. Appeals move forward somewhere beyond the walls. And the inmate waits, not for execution, but for something definitive, something final. The execution clock. The execution clock does not tick loudly. There is no visible timer, no countdown displayed on the wall, no daily reminder announcing how much time remains. In fact, most days on death row pass without any reference to execution at all. And yet, it is always present. Execution on death row exists as a structure rather than an event, a system waiting in the background, inactive but ready. Its presence is felt not through action, but through design. Everything about death row is built with the assumption that execution is possible at any time. This assumption shapes every rule. Housing is permanent. Movement is restricted. Privileges are minimal. Nothing is designed to prepare someone for release. The inmate becomes aware of this clock gradually, not because anyone explains it, but because it reveals itself in fragments. A policy change, a procedural update, a notice passed quietly from cell to cell when an execution date is set for someone else. Execution rarely feels personal at first. It happens to another inmate, another case, another file. The sound of routine does not change. The facility does not pause. The system absorbs the event without ceremony and continues operating as if nothing has occurred. This normalization is intentional. Executions are treated as administrative outcomes, not emotional disruptions. Staff are trained to maintain routine. The goal is stability, preventing escalation or unrest among those who remain. For the inmate, this creates a strange psychological contrast. On one hand, execution is a defining feature of death row. On the other, it is rarely acknowledged directly. The mind is left to reconcile these opposing realities without guidance. Some inmates cope by distancing themselves entirely. They avoid thinking about execution dates, refuse to ask questions, and disengage from conversations that might bring the topic closer. Others do the opposite. They track details obsessively, dates, procedures, patterns, attempting to impose order on something inherently uncontrollable. This focus does not provide comfort. It provides familiarity. Both responses serve the same purpose: managing uncertainty. The execution clock does not move in predictable increments. Legal stays can halt it. Appeals can slow it. Policy changes can reset it entirely. Then, without warning, it can accelerate. This unpredictability prevents anticipation. There is no reliable way to prepare emotionally. Any attempt to do so risks exhaustion long before the event ever occurs. As a result, most inmates place the clock outside daily awareness. It becomes abstract. The system reinforces this abstraction. Daily life on death row does not include reminders of execution procedures. Cells do not contain information about the process. Staff do not discuss it. Even medical evaluations are framed in general terms. Execution exists, but quietly, When an execution date is scheduled, the atmosphere changes subtly. Movement may increase. Security protocols tighten. Administrative activity becomes more visible. But these changes are not explained. Inmates learn to recognize the signs without being told. This indirect awareness heightens tension without naming it. The mind fills in gaps left by silence. Rumors circulate, often incomplete or inaccurate. The lack of official communication forces inmates to interpret their environment, increasing stress. For those not directly affected, witnessing the system activate reinforces the reality of their own sentence. Execution stops being hypothetical. It becomes operational. And then it recedes again. The clock resets. Days return to routine. This cycle, activation, suspension, normalization, becomes part of life on death row. Over time, it changes how the inmate relates to mortality itself. Death becomes neither immediate nor distant. It exists in a suspended state, always possible but rarely imminent. This psychological positioning allows survival. If execution were always imminent, the mind could not endure. If it were always distant, the sentence would lose its meaning. The system maintains balance by keeping the clock partially obscured. By now, the inmate understands something critical. Death row is not designed to count down. It is designed to wait. The execution clock does not move toward zero. It hovers, and that hovering shapes every thought, every routine, every adaptation. Acceptance or resistance. On death row, acceptance does not look the way people expect. It is not peace. It is not forgiveness. And it is not agreement with the sentence. Acceptance in this environment is quieter and more complicated. It is the point at which the inmate stops trying to change what cannot be changed and begins deciding how to exist within that reality. For some, this moment arrives gradually. For others, it never arrives at all. Resistance takes many forms. In the early stages, resistance is emotional. Anger at the system, fixation on injustice, refusal to engage with routine. This kind of resistance is loud internally, but largely invisible to the institution. It does not disrupt operations, and it does not alter outcomes. Over time, this emotional resistance becomes exhausting. Maintaining constant opposition to an unresponsive system drains energy without producing results. The mind eventually confronts a choice: continue resisting internally or redirect effort toward survival. Acceptance begins here. It is not surrender. It is recalibration. The inmate learns where resistance is futile and where it can still exist meaningfully. Rules are followed not because they are respected, but because violating them offers no advantage. Routine is observed not out of obedience, but out of necessity. This form of acceptance is pragmatic. Some inmates find structure within the confines of the cell. Reading, writing, exercise, or strict personal schedules become ways to impose order on an otherwise static existence. These activities do not change the sentence, but they preserve a sense of agency. Others resist acceptance entirely. They refuse routine. They disengage. Days blur together without structure or purpose. This resistance does not express itself outwardly, but it manifests as withdrawal, a slow narrowing of engagement with the world. Both paths are visible on death row. Neither is encouraged. Neither is discouraged. From the institution's perspective, stability is the goal. How that stability is achieved psychologically is secondary. Acceptance also reshapes how inmates relate to others. Communication, when it occurs, becomes deliberate. Words are chosen carefully. Emotional expression is restrained. Vulnerability feels dangerous in an environment where privacy does not truly exist. Trust becomes rare. This narrowing of emotional range is not cruelty. It is adaptation. As years pass, many inmates reach a state that observers sometimes mistake for calm. They appear composed. They follow routine. They do not react visibly to legal developments or institutional changes. This calm is often misunderstood. It is not the absence of fear. It is a containment of it. Fear has been folded into daily life, no longer requiring constant attention. The mind has learned to coexist with uncertainty without confronting it directly. For others, resistance remains active. Appeals are pursued relentlessly. Grievances are filed. The system is challenged wherever possible. This resistance provides purpose, even if it rarely produces change. Purpose matters. Without it, time becomes unbearable. Acceptance and resistance are not permanent states. Inmates may move between them over years, even over days. A legal update can revive resistance. A denial can push the mind back toward acceptance. This fluctuation is normal. What remains constant is the environment, the cell, the routine, the isolation. Against this backdrop, the inmate's inner world becomes a primary space where life continues. Death row does not demand that inmates accept their sentence. It demands that they live with it. By this stage, the initial shock has passed. The transport is a memory. Intake is complete. The first cell is familiar. The first night has repeated itself hundreds of times. Life has been reduced, but it has not stopped. This realization is unsettling. It challenges common assumptions about death row, that it is defined solely by execution or by the end it represents. In reality, it is defined by the time before that end and by how that time is endured. Acceptance, when it comes, is not about death. It is about living under permanent uncertainty without being consumed by it. Resistance, when it persists, is not about escape. It is about refusing to let the system define the entirety of one's inner life. Both are responses to the same reality, and neither offers resolution. Waiting for the state. Death row is often described as a place of endings. But for those who live inside it, death row is defined less by what happens and more by what is not. There is no release date to count toward, no rehabilitation milestone to reach, no transformation that changes the outcome. Instead, there's waiting for legal decisions made far from the cell, waiting for calendars that do not belong to the inmate, waiting for a system that moves at its own pace, unaffected by time spent inside concrete walls. From the moment a sentence becomes final, life is reorganized around that wait. Transport removes choice. Intake removes identity. Isolation reshapes thought. Routine replaces intention. Appeal stretch time. And the execution clock hovers, present, but never fully visible. This is a reality of death row. Not constant violence, not continuous drama, but prolonged uncertainty, enforced silence, and years measured by procedure rather than progress. For some inmates, acceptance becomes a way to endure. For others, resistance becomes the last remaining form of control. Neither path offers escape. What remains is existence within a structure designed to outlast emotion, memory, and resistance itself. A structure that does not demand belief or agreement, only compliance and time. Death row does not ask inmates to prepare for death. It asks them to live indefinitely in its shadow. And in doing so, it raises questions that extend beyond the prison walls, about punishment, about justice, and about what it means for a society to maintain a system built entirely around waiting. Because the true sentence of death row is not only execution, it is time. Time that cannot be reclaimed. Time that does not heal. Time that simply passes, one control day at a time. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.